Specifically, what is it, where can it be located, and how can I use it to advance student achievement? With this in mind, we will begin this lesson with a visit to West Seneca, where we will meet Denny Atkinson, who serves as Manager of Technology Services for the Western New York Regional Information Center, oftentimes referred to as the RIC.
There is plenty of data available for school improvement. You can look in a number of different places for it, but I'm going to draw your attention to two in particular. The first place that you may want to look is the New York State website. There's a website called data.nised.gov, and in that there is just a tremendous amount of data about school performance, individual schools, school districts, everybody in New York State, every single school district in New York State is included in that data warehouse. And you can see how did the students perform on the 3 to 8 ELA and math and science tests, how did they do on Regents exams, generally what number of students are performing at proficiency levels or higher. And so you can just get an overall snapshot of how is a school doing, but it also breaks the information down into subgroup information. So you can find out how different subpopulations of a school are doing. So you can look at the school data and see, well, are the boys doing better than the girls? Is there a difference in the white versus the non-white populations in a school? How about students with disabilities? Are they performing as well? Typically they don't perform as well as the general population of the school, but how are they doing? And how do they compare to students in other schools? How is that group of students doing? You can look at all of the subgroup information, and what you can't do in the statewide data warehouse is you can't look at a specific classroom of kids. You can't look at an individual student. You can't see how is Jason doing in math. It's not going to tell you that. That's confidential student information. It's clearly not available on that site. What the statewide data warehouse does do is it breaks down those subgroups and shows you how a subgroup of students will do. And as long as there are 5 or more students in that subgroup, you can see how they're doing. If there are fewer, if there's only one Pacific Islander in your school, they're not going to have that information up because, again, that would be breaching the confidentiality of the schools. So that's one kind of information that's available, and that's publicly available information, and I encourage you to get really comfortable with the data in the statewide data warehouse. Throughout New York State, there are regional data warehouses that have, in addition to the publicly available information from the state, they have that, but they also have much more detailed information about students, about their performance, about the demographic information about individual students, and how the students are performing at a classroom or individual level. The regional data warehouses are available in a number of different places within the state. There are 12 regional data warehouses, and depending on what part of the state you're in, you're going to go to one data warehouse or another. In Western New York, it's the Western New York Regional Information Center. The website for that is dataview.winnyrick.org, and that is available to only limited users in a school. Just anybody can't just go into that site and get information about students. You have to have an account. You have to sign confidentiality agreements. Access to the regional data warehouses is typically superintendent of schools, building administrators, curriculum directors, and the district data coordinators. Sometimes they're called the chief information officers in schools. They all have access to the reports, and they're typically looking at different things as they go into them. The CIO or DDC position, typically that person is looking at information that's submitted to the state through the data warehouse for compliance purposes. They're making sure all the demographic information, all the test information, that sort of thing from the students is available. Often they're a really good resource for other administrators, for teachers, for finding out information about classroom or student performance. So that's one of the first people you may want to talk to about getting access to information from a regional data warehouse. If an individual teacher wanted to get access to the data and they don't have a data warehouse account, typically what they would do would be approach the curriculum director or the district data coordinator, sometimes that's called the chief information officer of a school, or the superintendent, and explain what kind of data they're looking for. And it's important to carefully form that question. You don't want to just say, give me all the data on my student's performance, because that's overwhelming and frankly not that useful. You really have to parse your questions. You have to figure out what is it that I'm trying to learn from these data. Now, sometimes you just want to get an overall view. How did my class do? Did they do well? Did they do poorly? Well, that's important to know. And is there a difference in how some of the students in my class are performing on the assessments? Are my students in poverty typically underperforming or significantly underperforming? How are they doing? What's going on there? Are the boys doing better than the girls doing better than the boys? Those kinds of questions are going to develop, and you really have to take a look at the data to see what's going on. You're going to see things that you might not notice, but you really do have to be looking for, you have to form those questions, because if you just ask for all the data, you're not going to see it. And you probably won't get a report showing the specific subgroups that you're interested in looking at. When you're looking at student data, the first thing that we look at when we look at a building is what's the performance look like? How many students are achieving proficiency? So you're kind of taking a temperature of a building. How well is that building or that class of students doing? That's useful, and it kind of gives you a sense of what's going on, particularly if you compare that to the performance of another group, say the general population of the region or of all the kids in New York State. But that's really not terribly helpful, because at this point, you're answering the question, how well did my students do? But you're not answering how did they do well, or how did they do poorly. You really have to dig into the data, and just knowing that they didn't do well, what do? You teach harder? That really isn't going to help very much. You really have to get to what is it that the students are doing well in, and where are the deficiencies in their performance. When you're looking at individual student data or classroom data, again, you could look at the overall performance, but really what you want to know is what do the kids know and what don't they know? What are they able to show you in the assessment? So the fact that 75% of them achieve proficiency is nice to know, but what does that actually mean? What are the questions that they're able to address accurately? What standards do they understand and what do they not know? The state assessment data is actually very useful when you get down to the item analysis data. Now, item analysis is the study of student responses to individual questions. Typically, you don't look at individual student performance and how did this one student do on a question. You're looking at a group of students to try to get a sense of how did your class do. The reports that are available show what percentage of the kids answered the questions correctly and how did they answer the questions. You really have to know two things about a question when you're doing this type of analysis. You have to know how difficult is the question. So how many kids in general typically answer that question correctly, And then you have to know, well, how did my students compare when looking at that specific question? What is the gap between my students' performance and the general population? Is it a positive gap? Is there a big difference? Am I doing better than, or are my students doing better than the students in the state? Or is it a negative gap? Are they doing less well than the rest of the state? Then you can take that a step further. Once you know that there's a gap in the performance, you can try to get at, well, what is it that they're not understanding? All the questions are identified by learning standard. So you can look at the learning standard, but even more importantly, in many cases, you can look at the actual question. Work with a test in hand, look at the response data in the item analysis report, and then by looking at those two things together, you can see how are your students doing on specific questions. When you're looking at the response data in an item analysis report, you're looking at individual questions that are tied to individual standards. You can look at the actual question and then see how did your students perform. How many of the students answered A, how many B, how many C, how many D? And by looking at the wrong answer, doing a wrong answer analysis, you can start to detect areas of misunderstanding. Did the students not grasp the concept at all? Does it look like they may have just made a calculation error? And a lot of them are doing it, so perhaps that's an area that you want to focus on. You can get a sense just by the distribution of responses. Let's say there are 32 kids in your class, 8 of them answered A, 8 B, 8 C, 8 D. If I were looking at those data, I'd say those kids have no idea. That response was the same as chance. So chances are pretty good that wasn't taught at all, or maybe it wasn't taught effectively. So that's a place to look at it. Common misunderstandings of concepts can be kind of parsed out of these questions by seeing how students responded to individual questions. The questions on an assessment range in difficulty from fairly easy to fairly difficult, and that is not by chance, that's by design. Most well-designed assessments have a range of questions, from easy questions to more difficult questions, and that's done so you can identify the level of performance that students are doing at. You wouldn't expect all of the students in the classroom to be able to answer the most difficult questions. That's going to be a small set of the kids in the class. By the same token, the easiest questions on the exam, you would expect all of the kids to get correct. So you have to keep that in mind as you're doing this item analysis. Is it a really hard question? Well, how much time do you really want to spend trying to get every kid to answer that question correctly? On the other hand, if there's an easy concept that seems to be eluding the kids, then perhaps that's a place you have to readdress in your instruction and in your analysis of what are you doing with those students in your classroom. One of the criticisms we've heard a lot is the timeliness of the data reporting on state assessments, particularly 3 to 8 assessments. In the past, those data haven't been available until sometimes the next school year. That's changing, and it's changing in a very positive way now. In the past, as I said, that the data weren't available until the next school year, and by then a teacher is dealing with a different group of students, and while the information is interesting, it might not be quite as relevant because the kids who didn't do well on that test are already in another grade. They've moved on. Now, this year, the information is going to be released much more quickly. The information about performance on individual items is going to be released in mid-May for the ELA exams and in early June for the math exams. This would give teachers a about a month of time to work on some of the deficiencies they might identify in the assessments, and work with kids on areas that we know they're going to need next year. So this is a time of the school year that could really be spent working on some remedial skills that were identified in the state assessments.
In addition to the confidential district, school, and student achievement data elaborated upon here by Mr. Atkinson, there are additional district-level assessment data that are generated by the RIC and publicly available online. Let's take a look. Any interested party can find the data by linking to this website address. Here you will find 3 years' worth of student learning data on every New York State standardized test, including grades 3 through 8 English language arts and math and all secondary level Regents examinations. For demonstration purposes we are going to select grade 7 ELA. You will also find a list of every school district in New York State. We will select Grand Island. You can also choose to compare a district's results to other districts in a county, your regional BOCES, or with individual districts. In our demonstration we will compare Grand Island to all districts in Area 1 BOCES along with all districts in New York State. We can also choose specific student subgroups. Here we chose to compare all students. Here's the comparison. Notice if you hover over a dot, the district's name will be displayed. Also notice that the results are displayed on an x-axis indexing financial need based upon free and reduced lunch eligibility and the y-axis indexing the percent of students at levels 3 and 4. Next we will change the NCLB subgroup and compare the results for economically disadvantaged students. Notice the shift. These are the Area 1 school districts with more poverty than Grand Island. At the same time, the disadvantaged students in these districts are also performing less well than Grand Island. Now let's change back and look at a comparison of all students. We now see displayed the districts with less poverty and higher student achievement than Grand Island. Here's a point of interest. Notice Grand Island's red dot. This is the all students view. Let's change the filter and again look at the economically disadvantaged view. All students. Economically disadvantaged students. Take a moment and ponder what might be happening in Grand Island as evidenced by these data sets. Notice Grand Island's relative position for both subgroups. The graphs indicate the economically disadvantaged students perform on a par with the non-disadvantaged students. This is a good example of how data can be used to assess the effectiveness of a district or school's programs.